Day 154. Zeb Fairley arrived in town to pick up the messages at the trading post at 5 a.m. Carl was with him. Carl wanted to get an early start to take another look at the scene of the murders. In his saddlebags, he had some dry plaster mix, which he would use to make castings of both the tire tracks from the van and the dirt bikes. The 4 soldiers that were stationed to guard the train reported that all was quiet during the night. Carl knew in his heart that somehow this attack was linked to the one last week against the post. After casting the plaster, he instructed the sentries to watch the site and not to let anyone near it. He would be back to collect the castings after they set. He then rode up to the Bezio homestead to have a word with Samantha Bezio. She heard his horse coming up the driveway and greeted him on the front porch with her shotgun. She made it perfectly clear that he was not welcome there. He explained that he understood how she felt, but that he was going to have a look around. She leveled the shotgun at him and told him that she forbid him to get off his horse, and that if he tried anything, she would cut him down without hesitation. He pondered his next move for a moment. It was fairly certain he could disarm her without incident, but the last thing he needed or wanted was for her to get killed during the scuffle. After all, she was holding a loaded shotgun, which was pointed at him. He could try to disarm her safely, but there were no guarantees. In order to save his own life, it might at some point become necessary for him to shoot her. Still, he understood her anger. She had just lost her oldest son and husband last week. A husband that died at Carl's hand. He looked her in the eye and told her he would be back. She responded that he could choose whichever day he wanted to die. He backed his horse up slowly and turned and rode away. She stood watching from the porch until he cleared the gate. He tied off his horse a few hundred yards down the road and walked back up through the woods out of sight. He approached the barn from the side and peeked in through a broken window. He had seen the tire tracks all up the driveway and had a pretty good idea of what he would find inside. Sure enough, there they were. 2 older Yamaha DT Series Enduros. Just then, a second-floor window in the house opened, and a man with a .30-30 carbine started firing at Carl. The window shattered, and Carl jumped back behind a large stand of trees. He looked to see where the shots were coming from and quickly returned fire. Another man ran out the back door and started shooting in Carl's direction as well. Carl immediately ran down the embankment behind him, providing himself with cover. He continued to run as fast as he could through the woods, several hundred yards to the road. He could hear the occasional bullet whiz by close to him. The gunman was too far back to get a good shot at him, and when Carl got to his horse, he mounted quickly and rode off as fast as he could. The man in the upstairs window was approaching the barn about the same time the second man was returning from chasing Carl. He went to start one of the bikes to give chase, but the other man stopped him. He explained that they had to gather their stuff and get out of there quickly. He knew Carl would get reinforcements and return directly. They radioed to another group member who came with the van, and together they loaded all they could. The other men rolled the bikes out of the barn. The van, with the driver and Samantha and her youngest son as well as the 2 bike riders, rode out as quickly as they could. They drove 14 miles up the old dirt road and turned off down a long gravel drive. At the end was an old farmhouse where the group's new leader lived with some of the members. His name was Tyler Hobbs. He helped form the group with Bailey Bezio months ago and took over as leader following Bailey's death. He welcomed Samantha and the others and explained that she must stay there now and could not return to her homestead. He knew that her exposure now had to be extremely limited since Carl now knew that she was part of the group. He told her she would have to stay there on the farm and work behind the scenes. that she could serve in a support and planning role, but that she had been compromised. Samantha was okay with that. She really didn't have the stomach for the killing anyway. Carl rode straight to the church to recruit a few deputies to go back to the Bezio homestead with him. Greg volunteered, as did Josh and Dalton. Together they returned to the Bezios to find everyone gone. Carl noticed that it appeared that they had cleared the majority of the stuff out of the house and believed that they would not be returning. He set the plaster casts of the tire tracks there as well. Carl needed to get back to work on the investigation. He asked Greg if he could spare one of the guys to sit on the scene and wait for the cast to dry. He explained that he didn't think anyone would be returning. Greg ordered Dalton and Josh to remain behind and to package up the castings when they dried and deliver them directly to Carl's office. Greg returned to the church and his job there. Carl rode back into town to continue his investigation. Up in the hills at the home of Tyler Hobbs, the citizens of Liberty had all assembled and were discussing their next moves. When Greg rode back onto church property, he went and sat next to the fireplace in the pavilion. He ladled himself some stew from the pot that was left over from dinner and poured a cup of coffee. As he sat eating, Roger walked up to the pavilion and approached him. He told Greg that he had seen all the activity coming and going from the church today and that he was available if Greg needed him. Greg looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Don't take this the wrong way, pal, but I don't trust you." Roger stared back and after a moment responded, "Yeah, I can understand that. I suppose if I were in your shoes, I wouldn't trust me either. You really don't know me at all, and given the circumstances of me being here, yeah, I completely understand. Just know that I'm no stranger to weapons and tactics, and if the time does come when you may have no choice but to trust me, that I'll be here and ready to help." Before Greg could respond, Roger turned and walked away. He went out back to where his tent was pitched and sat and smoked and drank his coffee alone. Jillian, who was behind the chimney drawing water into a bucket from the spigot there, walked out into sight. She had heard the conversation between Roger and Greg. She looked at Greg and said, "You know, he's a good man, Greg. We've all done things in our past that we regret. Why don't you give him a chance to be the person he wants to be? If any one of us opened our closet doors and let the world look inside to reveal who we all really are, none of us would be found guiltless there, Greg." Greg just looked at Jillian, and then he answered, "I know, honey, you're right. I also know you have great discernment when it comes to the character of others. Further than that, I also know that you strive to see the good in everybody. And while I commend and respect that, I have an added responsibility to this group. That is to keep everyone here safe." Then he paused and said, "Honey, I love the way you are, the way you look at people and the way you look at the world. I'm not judging your friend. I'm just being cautious. That's my job here. Let's just give it some time. I've been watching him, and I'll continue to watch him. It's all been good so far. He's a hard worker, and he has been an asset to us in the few short days he's been here. He's been welcome and accepted by everyone, including me. I still reserve the right to keep him at arm's length until I'm absolutely sure about him. I hope you understand." She smiled and nodded. Yes, she did understand. But in her heart, she was already certain of Roger. She poured Greg another cup of coffee, placed her gentle hand on his strong shoulder, and said good night. Carl was in town, back in his office. He had the plaster castings he took at the train site on his desk. Dalton and Josh had just delivered the castings he took at Bezio's. He examined them side by side. There was no doubt that they were a match. Both the vehicle and the motorcycle tracks matched exactly. Carl assessed the situation as it stood. With the 2 missing dirt bikes and 1 vehicle involved, that meant a minimum of 3 people. 4 when you added Samantha Bezio. She could not have been driving the van, as it was not in the barn when Carl looked in earlier. No, a person, or group of persons, had driven it there to retrieve her. Judging by the emptiness of her house, he knew it was most likely a truck or a van that would have been needed to move all that much stuff. In reality, he did not know how large the group was. He did, however, know for certain that it was a group of at least 4. He stared out his window and thought long and hard about what it all meant. Major Stillman knocked on the door jamb as he entered. He asked Carl to bring him up to speed on the investigation. Carl motioned for him to sit. He told him all he knew. Major Stillman had been good to Carl. He had given him everything he needed to do his job, and always supported him as best he could. Still, though, Carl couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something about him that made Carl not fully trust him. Early on, he dismissed it as a result of his own military service, his own reasons that led him to withdraw from the mainstream, and had soured him to authority of any kind except God's authority, especially that of the military. Carl held great disdain for the military in every form, but that wasn't it. The more time that elapsed, the surer Carl was. Something wasn't tracking correctly about the Major. Still, he couldn't identify it. The more time went on, the more Carl could not let it go. He needed to figure it out. He had shared his concerns with nobody except Abigail. He had shared everything that troubled him with her. She was the only person he could ever completely trust. This fact gave him great comfort. He always referred to her as his Proverbs 31 wife, a designation that always made her smile, no matter how many times she heard it. As Major Stillman talked to Carl, briefing him on the other events of the day that took place, Carl was thinking intensely. What was it about the Major? What was he hiding? It was almost becoming an obsession with Carl. "Carl! Carl!" Major Stillman repeated. Carl looked directly at him. "Are you with me here, Carl?" the Major asked. Yes, Carl responded. I'm sorry, Major. It's been a long day." "Of course," the Major said. "We'll pick this back up tomorrow. Go home and get some rest." It was late. Carl decided to sleep on the couch in his office. He just nodded at Major Stillman as he rose and walked out. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe to my channel, please. God bless you.